Seago, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, November 19th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity, and we do step on a few toes along the way sometimes. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people that our audio streams live at www.letstalknative.com. And we stream live video of the show on our Facebook group page or pages via Facebook Live. Our shows are available as podcasts on your favorite podcast platforms after our broadcast. We take the video of this show and we post it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. And so I encourage people to subscribe to both our podcast and our YouTube channel. I am the host and the producer of the show. I'm assisted in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our audio and our video. Let's get into it. All right. So there's this thing coming up in December. It is a meeting in Washington, D.C. to talk about working out the details or the specific regulations that they're trying to put together for what they're calling the General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act. They actually call it the General Welfare Act or Welfare Exclusion Act, the GWEA. I'm sure they're going to come up with a great thing. What are they going to call it? GUIA? The GUI, maybe. I don't know. But so this General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act, let me explain what it is before I start blasting what it is, or what the problem is with it. Because I'm going to talk about taxation today. I'm going to talk about why we can make such a strong case and should make a strong case against pushing back and rejecting both state and federal taxing authorities on our lands. But so here's this General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act. And here's what the federal government is saying that they are trying to gift to us. They're trying to pass legislation to allow us to avoid or to be excluded from taxation for certain benefits that we get as Native people from our own tribal governments. And I don't like using the word tribal, but that, just to use their words. So the idea of a General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act is to say, okay, we want to be able to ascertain which benefits individuals get from their nations that we want to provide tax exemption to. Now, this still may not mean anything. People still wonder, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, to be clear, the federal government thinks that they can tax everything, right? They think Native people are, or they argue that we are taxable. There's no foundation for it, but they argue that they can tax anybody, including Native people. But they've even go so far to say, well, if you get provided a benefit that we can assign a monetary value to, let's say it's a health insurance, we can tax you for that. If you get something, some sort of benefit through housing, and that house becomes yours and becomes your property, then we can assign a value to that and we can tax you for that. So let's say you get a house through a housing program and you get a certain subsidy for that housing from your nation. The federal government says, oh, we can tax that. So this General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act is their attempt to say, well, you know what, we're going to give you some deference on that. We're going to give you some exclusions for some of the tribal benefits that you get. But there's a catch. They said, we need to determine that, for one thing, you're not getting paid for service. So they're trying to be very, very clear. We're not going to allow you to claim your income from your wage, from the work or the performance of work that you do. No, we're not giving you a tax exemption on that, which is problematic. But we are saying that if you get a benefit, just a general benefit from your nation, as long as it's not too extravagant. So some white men in Washington are actually trying to get Native people involved in the conversation so they can determine what benefit would be too extravagant for this exclusion. I mean, the fact that we still top every list you don't want to top, like, suicide rates, substance abuse, everything. I mean, death by cop. I mean, missing and murdered Indigenous women. Unemployment. The lowest life expectancy. All those lists that you don't want to be the lead in. None of that stuff's going to matter because they're going to say, even though none of that stuff gets affected by your tribal benefits, we're going to determine which ones are too extravagant. I mean, this is, in the words of my buddy Raj John, this is where racism creeps in to even something that many people are going to try to say, oh, this is something they're trying to give this to us. No, they aren't. No, they aren't. They aren't trying to give something. They're trying to compartmentalize something very, very specific, very, very limited. And in doing so, getting us to concede, but everything else is taxable. So they're trying to get us to concede and to agree and essentially sign on to their taxing authority by recognizing that they have the right to exclude us over a limited number of things. They're opening up a noose and they're saying, no, go ahead, stick your head in here. Stick your head in here because it's going to be like a warm hug. No, it's not. It's going to be like hanging yourself. So, I mean, and the Seneca Nation is participating in this. And I'm not going to, sit there and say, okay, I'm not charging Seneca Nation officials, but I guarantee you their lawyers, I guarantee you their lawyers are saying, oh, no, we need to help define what these exclusions are. Well, here's the problem with that. We have to challenge at its foundation whether the federal government has any taxing authority over us or not. And look, it doesn't matter if you have paid taxes. It doesn't matter if you do pay taxes, because that's not the same thing as the federal government having the right or the authority to tax you. I mean, they're assuming that they're trying to convince you that they're assuming this authority and that their taxing agents, their IRS and everybody else can try to squeeze us. But we don't really effectively fight it. In fact, there's so much that we don't fight in terms of our identity and the distinction of not only us as individuals, but our lands and where we are. And I always got to go back to the same thing. Imagine anybody, male or woman. Yeah, let's just say a woman. A woman works in, perhaps she's the receptionist at the tribal council offices at the Williams Seneca building. So she makes her $17 an hour answering phones and directing people to their, to where they need to go when they call in or when they walk in the building. She's Seneca. She lives on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. Her home is something that is here on Seneca, really clearly defined and established and recognized Seneca land. Her children are Seneca. She lives here. She works here. She works for the government, the Seneca Nation government. She's not selling her labor to an industry someplace else. She's not selling cigarettes even. I mean, and I'm not trying to parse it in such a way that I'm saying those things are taxable. But here's this woman doing this work as a Seneca person, working for the Seneca people and giving her life's service in the service of the Seneca Nation and the Seneca people. And the federal government gets to take a third of her income. What? Wait, what? How is that possible? How could the federal government, a separate government, assert taxation on the income of a Seneca person or any Native person for that matter, or living, working within the Seneca Nation, for the Seneca Nation, for the Seneca people, how can the federal government claim, as a separate government, claiming tax authority to take a third of that income? Now, if what I just explained to you sounds absurd, that happens all over. That's what's happening to every tribal counselor, every nation employee. And you know what? It's not even limited to the nation employees. And there's a lot of those people, by the way. We're talking about a lot of people here. Thousands of people that work for the Seneca Nation in one way or another. But even if you don't work for the Seneca, if you work on Seneca Nation territory, if you're deriving your income from putting your time in to a job on Seneca territory, and I would argue even off Seneca territory, if you live here and this is who you are as a person, where does the federal government get the right to tax that? Well, and I'll tell you, from nowhere. There is no place in history where there's ever been a delineation or an establishment of the United States having the authority, state and the individual states or the federal government, to assert taxing authority over Native people. Right from the start, let's be clear. Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States, Article 2, it talks about taxation and apportionment of representation, and it's very clear that when they're listing who should be counted, who should be represented, and who is taxable, they say this, that it includes 3/5 of all slaves, essentially black people, and excludes Indians not taxed, excluding Indians not taxed. So, seems redundant to say, okay, then we can't tax somebody who's not taxed. Well, yeah, that's the command of the English language by the founding fathers of the United States. So they clearly distinguish that we are not a part of their constitution, that we're not a part of their country, that we're not taxable, and we are not to be counted for apportionment of representation in Congress. It's clear. Now, nothing has changed since then. There's nothing there's no treaty, there's no concession, there's no referendum, there's no, suit or request, nothing from the Seneca Nation that ever says, oh yeah, can you now include us? There's been a lot of assumptions. And some of those assumptions are based on essentially something that's illegal. I mean, it's illegal for the United States to strip, or for any country, to strip somebody's nationality and impose their nationality upon somebody. That's called denationalization. It would later be defined as one of the elements of genocide. In 1924, well, let me back up. So when they write the Constitution, they clearly know that we are not part of their system, that we are not taxed, we are not represented. In fact, we're mentioned two other places in the U.S. Constitution. One where the executive, the president of the United States, has the authority to negotiate treaties with us, and we're specifically listed right alongside foreign nations, foreign countries, that the president of the United States has the authority to negotiate treaties with us. That's the other place. Now, the third place is in what's called the Commerce Clause. Now, the Commerce Clause, this is, again, a hugely mischaracterized provision of the U.S. Constitution. It says, Congress shall have the authority to regulate commerce in and amongst several states, with foreign nations, and with Indian tribes. Now, I want to say one word I got to repeat. With Indian tribes, not of Indian tribes. It doesn't say they have the power to regulate our commerce. What it says it has the power to do is regulate their commerce with us. So they can regulate what an American does, just like they can regulate how an American conducts commerce with foreign nations. They put us in the exact same. So in the two places, the Treaty Clause and the Commerce Clause, we are mentioned as equal in the same light as foreign nations. The other place that were mentioned is when they're trying to figure out how they're going to apportion taxation and representation under the Constitution. And they say, well, we're not talking about Native people. We're not talking about Indians. They're not taxed. They're non-taxed. So after, all of the battles over, slavery and the Civil War, and they passed the 14th Amendment where they try to clear up who is and isn't a citizen, they talk about that all persons born within the United States and under U.S. jurisdiction are citizens. Now, they're talking about black people. They're talking about slaves, primarily. They aren't talking about us because we're not under the jurisdiction. And how do I know they're not talking about us? Besides my own assessment that we weren't under their jurisdiction, is because that's in 1868, I think. In 1924, they attempt to correct that by saying, well, we declare all Native people are hereby citizens of the United States, provided nothing in this provision violates their personal property or their tribal property or whatever else. Now, the idea that they think they could pass a law that just declares us, essentially not just, let's be clear, it isn't just that the language says they declare us to be U.S. citizens, but the implication is that we are no longer distinct, citizens of our own nations. By declaring us U.S. citizens, they're attempting to strip us of our own. And that's illegal. For 10 years, the international community is already listing that kind of behavior as a war crime. And most of us never acknowledged that. And you know what? That was not successful either. How do I know that? Because 10 years later, they pass another law called the Indian Reorganization Act, where they try to define Native people, literally defining an Indian as somebody who is under the jurisdiction. Now, if we're not under their jurisdiction, we're left out in limbo someplace, and that's still a problem because their definition, many of us rejected the Indian Reorganization Act. That was an attempt also to get away from traditional governance and the governance that we use for thousands of years in some cases, and create these little mini U.S. versions of Indian country, by having a U.S. style constitution and delegation of authorities along the same lines as theirs and that kind of thing. So the idea of reorganizing ourselves as these little constitutional republics was something that many Native territories rejected. And their definition as a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States, many of us rejected that. And the fact that we rejected it is still an issue today because when the federal government is looking at federally recognized Native peoples who are trying to reclaim lost lands, they say, look, if you weren't under our jurisdiction in 1934, then you can't make a claim to have lands put into trust for you. Well, that's interesting. So you're saying that many of us weren't, although we were Native, you're acknowledging that we weren't under your jurisdiction in 1934. So there's so many places that this thing breaks down and doesn't hold up. And the reason I'm bringing all this up because this all goes back to whether the federal government has the authority to tax us, among other things. So it has always, every attempt to do something that would place us under their wing has failed. And they acknowledge that it fails because they still have provisions in today's law that revert back to what they call the 1934 rule. That they're acknowledging that even after the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, that there were clearly Native people who were not under U.S. jurisdiction. Well, if we weren't under jurisdiction, it means that we weren't their citizens. It means that we weren't taxable. And if we weren't taxable in 1792, and we weren't taxable in 1794, and if we weren't taxable in 1924, 34, then at what point are you saying we're taxable? I mean, they passed the income tax statute in 1913, I think, is when the Internal Revenue Service, the income tax was established then. And that is a bit of a hurdle because that kind of tax was not laid out in the original Constitution. They had to create that taxing authority. Now, here's where it's also problematic. The Seneca Nation has no taxing authority. They have no law that allows them to tax their own people. There's nothing in Seneca Nation law, custom, tradition, law, history, even in their previous manifestation under the Guyana de Gore, or what people call the chief system, but it was really supposed to be the clan system. There was nothing that ever established an authority to create taxation on Seneca territory. So the only taxation that takes place on Seneca Nation, look, we can get into disputing whether Seneca Nation is charging certain fees that could be interpreted that way, but really the only entity that claims to have tax is the federal government. And they claim it without asserting any foundation. Again, I go back to the receptionist having a third of her income being taken by the federal government. Now, it isn't literally the federal government isn't literally coming in and taking it from her. Her employer, the Seneca Nation, is remitting a third of her income to the federal government. So there's this complicity, and again, there is tax payment, assumed authority, taxing authority, even in the absence of actual taxing authority. And this is where the problems exist. So to show up down at 1500 Pennsylvania Ave on December 3rd to discuss the General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act is pretty problematic. Because if you're going to suggest we're going to fight for this narrow establishment of certain benefits that we can get that come from our nations, the administrations on our territories, that a certain amount of those benefits that we receive that meet a certain category are not taxable. So are we saying everything else is? I mean, this gets into some of the problems we have with, fighting the IRS over the annuity checks that the Senecas receive. Is that taxable? Well, why would it be? The federal government's been trying to subpoena and squeeze the Seneca Nation for years over this. Now, most people are oblivious to these conversations. Now, what the Seneca Nation did in an attempt to make sure that income would not be taxable was they don't give away a percentage of gaming revenue. That's not the way it works. Senecas don't get gaming revenue. What they get, or what the Seneca Nation does, is they charge the gaming corporation a lease for the place to run the casinos. So what the Senecas get in terms of annuities comes from the lease of the property to the Seneca Gaming Corporation. So it's a payment, it's an income derived from the land. This is an area that the IRS is still troubled with. They won't really come out and say it. They have in the past, and that's why we still have some of that stuff that we can rely on. But they have in the past said, well, we don't consider income derived from the land taxable. They claim every other income is. So income derived from the land, that sounds like farming. Well, it also would include rental. I mean, I got a friend up north who the IRS has been chasing after because he derives some income from homes that he rents out. Well, that's not taxable. But the IRS agent up there in Akwesasne doesn't know that. And we can tell them. But there is no, the IRS has acknowledged that income derived from the land, which would include leasing something on the land, like leasing property. So essentially what the Senecas get in terms of annuity is not gaming revenue, it's lease income. It's lease income the Seneca Nation gets from the gaming corporation that they distribute to the, and this isn't a ploy. It's a system that they put in place for how the Seneca Nation derives income from gaming. Now, This is still a battle, though. I mean, we still have the IRS still trying to figure out how they can not only tax that, they even want to tax, other benefits, sitting fees on committees and that kind of stuff, which, frankly, sitting fees to sit on a committee, even under this General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act, would be taxable. Why? Because you're getting paid for a service that you're providing. So it's really problematic, and it's part of the reason that we should not play this game. We should not stick our head in that noose. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, where this thing really gets racist, and of course it's all racist because the failure of the federal government or state government or any taxing authority or anybody to recognize our distinction is a failure to recognize that we are not them. By claiming that we are them, they are saying that we have been subjugated, and we haven't. And the assumption is that we are just too primitive, and that subjugation. Literally, the word means under the yoke. It means that that we've been put into their service, not just as military, but to subjugate somebody means that you've put them under you. I mean, that's racist. I mean, that's superiority, inferiority. That's the hierarchy. That's the whole idea of being superior to somebody is when you can place somebody beneath you. It's the definition of racism. But the best example of the racism tied to this specific provision is that angle to say, well, we need to establish that the benefit that we're going to exclude from taxation is not too extravagant. And to be clear, when they want to define extravagance, they're going to say it's relative to who we are, not relative to who they are. They're not going to say, well, our doctors drive Porsches. Our CEOs, pull in X amount of billions of dollars and they have all these, yachts. And so if we have a yacht, it's extravagant because we're only native people. And we shouldn't have luxuries. We should only have necessities. That's the racist part of this law. All right, we'll take a break. I want to get into some specifics, and I've written quite a bit on this subject. So I want to go through some history and put a finer point on some of this stuff. But we'll do it when we come back. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native, and we'll be right back.
Simple song, simple man, and simple thrift store clothes and a simple thing. And he's gonna make it someday. He's gonna make it someday. That was a lifetime ago. A lifetime ago. Lifetime ago. A lifetime ago, a lifetime ago, lifetime ago. Ain't no thief gonna take my gold. Ain't no priest gonna save my soul. Ain't no thief gonna take my gold. Ain't no priest gonna save my soul. My soul. My poor soul. My soul. And you know me, I'm a believer. And you know me, I couldn't leave her. And you know me, I'm a believer. You know me, I couldn't leave her if I tried. If I tried, Lord knows I've tried. Lord knows I've tried. He ain't no thief gonna take my gold. He ain't no priest gonna save my soul. He ain't no thief gonna take my gold. He ain't no priest gonna save my soul. My soul. My poor soul. My soul. My soul.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native, and we are talking about taxation. But before we get into that, let me talk about, we'll talk about revenue. I want to thank my sponsors because it's their contributions to what I do that give me the revenue to do what we do here. So I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and my good friends at GRE and NWS, that's Grand River Enterprises and Native Wholesale Supply, for supporting the programs that we do. And I'm not just talking about this program. I'm talking about the one that I do in New York City, and for that matter, the video productions that we do. And that's something that we are really trying to take the next step towards. Anybody who's watched the short form videos that we've done, you know that we have been honing our skill on that, and I think we've got a better product today than we did perhaps when we first started shooting them. And they are different than just recording a show. And we want to take the next step. We want to actually do a full length documentary. So we are working towards making sure that we have the equipment inventory to do something like that. And it's, the folks who support the show on a weekly and a monthly basis that allow us to peck away at building up that inventory. But for those of you who want to do more and want to step up, perhaps some of you who have supported us in the past that haven't in a while, we're looking to raise between $2,000 and $3,000 to buy some additional equipment so we can take the next step. So if you haven't contributed to the show in a while, please do keep us in mind, and you can look. I got a PayPal account. You can find. Maybe I'll post a link to it or something like that. But you can certainly reach out to me and make a contribution anyway. I also want to thank those who contribute by sharing the show. And I know that our podcast numbers are going up. Our YouTube numbers are going up. So I know that there are those of you who are sharing on Twitter and Instagram and on Facebook our shows and our messages, and I appreciate that. I got to give a special shout out to my wife who posts the Facebook live stream of this show onto several dozen group pages. So that's how we get the word out. And look, a lot of what I'm talking about here is stuff that people think they know or they know a little bit about, but don't know enough about. And I think it's important that people understand. One of the things that should be noted, but I'm careful on how I tell this next part of what I want to talk about, because I don't want to make this sound like a complaint. What I'm really trying to talk about is the distinction and how different it is to be a Native person living on Native lands, and in particular living as a Ungwe on Haudenosaunee lands, or again, more specifically, here living in Seneca territory. And it's not unique to Senecas, but what we can talk about some very specifics. But one of the things, let me give you an example of the attitude that guys like Thomas Jefferson had. And I've talked about this past. He wrote a letter to a guy who actually would be president later on, Henry Harrison, who was the governor of Indiana or something like that, territory, wasn't even a state. And he wanted to talk about how it is that he wanted to manage the relationship with Native people. And it's kind of creepy in a way, but I think it's important. And let me read a little bit of this. It says, the system is to live in perpetual peace with the Indians. to cultivate an affectionate attachment from them by everything just and liberal which we can offer them within the bounds of reason, by giving them effectual protection against the wrongs from our own people. So what he said is he wanted to cultivate our love from us. Now, he didn't want to cultivate an affectionate attachment with us. So he didn't want to have a relationship with us. He wanted to cultivate an affectionate attachment from us. So he wanted us to fall in love with them. I mean, and that's kind of creepy, but that's what Thomas Jefferson was telling Henry Harrison about the strategy to manage the relationship with Native people. And here's one of the ways that he wanted to do it. He said to promote this, and the whole idea was to try to draw our love, get us to love them, and then they can convince us that we should live like them and get rid of our lands. So to promote this disposition to exchange lands which they have to spare and we want for necessaries which we have to spare and they want, we shall push our trading houses. Now, these are essentially government-run trading houses. We should push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt. Because we observe that when these debts go beyond what the individuals can pay, they will become willing to lop them off by cession of their lands. At our trading houses, too, we mean to sell so low as to merely repay the cost. So we're gonna sell our stuff at cost. And to do this, because we want these guys to buy from us. So low as merely to repay the costs and charges, so as neither to lessen nor enlarge our capital. So they said, no, we're not going to sell them stuff to make them money, to make us money. We want to sell them stuff just to run them in debt. That was the whole plan. And let me. In this way, our settlements will gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, as they will in time either incorporate with us as citizens of the United States or remove beyond the Mississippi, which was also Jefferson's plan. In this way, our settlements will gradually. The former is certainly, again, to incorporate with them and become U.S. citizens. He said the former is certainly the termination of their history. So he acknowledged that if we become U.S. citizens, we simply will no longer exist as a culture. It will terminate our history. Most happy for themselves. But in the whole course of this, and again, this is still Jefferson writing here, but in the whole course of this, it is essential to cultivate their love. As to their fear, we presume that our strength and their weakness is now so visible that they must see we only have to shut our hands to crush them, and that our liberties to them proceed from motives of pure humanity only. Again, we need to convince them that we love them. We need to cultivate their love, and we need them to be convinced that everything we are offering them, we're doing purely out of just in humanity only, pure humanity only. Should any tribe be so foolhardy as to take up the hatchet at any time, the seizing of the whole country of that tribe and drive them across the Mississippi as the only condition of peace would be an example to others. So in this one letter, he talks about extermination, removal, assimilation, and of course, termination, which is when he says, once they become citizens, their history's done. And this is the great part. This is one of the great lines, and it sounds almost Nazi-esque. He says, again, when he says driving them across the Mississippi as the only condition of peace would be an example to others and a furtherance of our final consolidation. I mean, this has got final solution, written all over it. This is Thomas Jefferson saying this will be the furtherance of our final consolidation. Our final consolidation. This was the plan. To cultivate our love and affection and take our lands and eliminate our distinction under the threat of being crushed. This was Thomas Jefferson. Now, the reason I bring this up is because think about this thing. We couldn't borrow against our land, but they would run us in debt with the intentional purpose of convincing us to lop off that debt with our land. This was a way that, I mean, this is like the mortgage crisis of 2008. I mean, and again, keep in mind, he says, no, and don't sell them stuff to make money off them. We're gonna get their land. You don't need to, just sell at cost. Give them a mortgage rate. Give them a mortgage. Doesn't matter if they qualify or not. Doesn't matter if they qualify for lending them stuff. Give them credit. Give them a mortgage because we're going to foreclose. I mean, this is Thomas Jefferson. This is the enlightened one, right? This was supposed to be the enlightened president. No, this guy was a scumbag. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Now, the interesting thing is, at some point, our lands could no longer be lopped off to satisfy debt. I mean, this system worked. I mean, 95%, maybe even 98% of all our lands were surrendered through some of these very processes. And people say, yeah, but you sold that land. No, don't you understand that this was a covert exercise planned by the president of the United States? So no, don't give me this bullshit about, oh yeah, well, you guys just willingly sold your land. No, we were coerced. We were cheated. We were convinced to take all these wares that we probably didn't even need. Why? Because there was a no return policy. No, you're not going to return those pots and pans. No way. You're going to pay us with your land. But at some point, that no longer happens. And the reason I bring this up is because what people don't realize is that we don't have banking on our territory. We can't go to a bank, borrow money to build a house or to build a business. We can go to a bank and borrow to buy a car. Why? Because they can always repossess that. You can't repossess land. You can't, because the banks or any financial institution can't seize our property, real property, fixed assets like that. We can't start a company. We have built economies with a handicap that most people can't even imagine. Can you imagine trying to build an economy without banking? I'm not talking about merchant accounts here. I'm not talking about that because that's something we're paying for. That's not, I mean, this isn't the same as borrowing. I mean, the idea that everything we build on our territories is built out of premium, out of capital that we have to have in hand. Look, it is a handicap, but it also is what it makes us distinct. So when I hear the federal government talk about taxing us, when we don't even tax ourselves, that we've never even considered to assert taxing authority on our own people, and yet you think you can assert it on our own people, and we become somewhat complicit in it? Like I said, it doesn't matter if we have paid taxes. It doesn't matter if we do pay taxes. It still doesn't mean that you have the authority to tax us. You purporting that you have the assumed authority to tax us is not the same thing as asserting that you have the legal authority. Now, the crazy part is we don't get the benefit of even the taxes that you've been screwing us out of. And I'm not talking about the $1.5 billion that the state grabs from the Senate. I'm talking about every dime that you're squeezing out of everybody who has an income. And I'm not even talking about Social Security or disability. I'm talking about federal withholding taxes. I mean, we could argue, and there's plenty of people who say, well, if you pay Social Security, then you're a citizen. Well, that's not necessarily true either. I mean, that's an assumption. And look, I get the whole argument about, our birth certificates being, putting us on the list for potential gross national product and a lot of other stuff. And I know people have gone and made those arguments. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm just talking about plain and simple, the federal government not having the authority to tax us, and not only not having the authority to tax us, but trying to make people understand, and in this case, trying to make our own people understand there are reasons not to pay taxes. Not just because they don't have the authority to tax us, but because we don't benefit from any of that system. Their system out there, you can go to a bank and you can borrow. Out there, you have other things that are in place that tax dollars are connected to. Now, I mean, look, people say, "Oh, you have roads." Those roads that go through our territory aren't for us. The Thruway wasn't built for us. It was built for you with your tax dollars. And then we end up, I mean, the crazy part is, beyond the toll issue, the Seneca people have probably paid more in tolls since the 50s when they built the goddamn Thruway than they received for the easement for the Thruway in the first place. I mean, that's just effed up, man. That's just wrong on so many different levels. But then compound that with the fact that at a certain, and look, we haven't always been complicit with paying taxes. It's something that came back only several decades ago when a white man who worked for the Seneca Nation said, "You know what? I'm an employee and I got to pay federal income tax. You guys may not have been taxable, but I am." We could argue whether that was even true. But so he starts sending federal withholding. And of course, when people are barely making squat, federal withholding doesn't seem like very much. It's not a third of the income when you're on the poverty line. But now that people are starting to make, a decent wage, it's between 25 and 35% of your income. A Seneca counselor who's making $100,000 a year, $30,000 that the federal government makes. The federal government makes $30,000 off of every counselor. $60,000 from the president. I mean, it's absurd to think about this. That the federal government gets to profit from the Seneca Nation government employees, their own salaries. I mean, it's absurd. And through all of that, we don't have the infrastructure on our territories, especially the financial infrastructure that exists for everybody else that's out there. And I say that not as a complaint. Again, we're different. We aren't white people. We aren't Americans. And look, and if you're a Seneca and you consider yourself American, then God bless you. but the reality is that's a personal choice. But I'll tell you, you aren't living in the United States if you're living on the Cattaraugus territories of the Seneca Nation. You're not living in New York State. They may be surrounded us, but there's, and I've gone through this many times, but there is no place in U.S. history that shows a transfer of land title from the Seneca Nation, from the Seneca people, to the United States. Not only title, but jurisdiction, sovereignty. I mean, look, after the whole invasion of Iraq and all that other stuff, they made a big grand deal when the United States finally handed their sovereignty back to them. They said there was a transfer of sovereignty back to Iraq. Yeah, how'd that work out? After they destroyed the country, they said, "Oh, we transitioned back and we gave them their sovereignty back." Well, the funny thing is about Native people is, you know what? We never surrendered in the first place. So you can't claim legitimately. You can claim it. You can say it. You can say that we're U.S. citizens. But if we haven't asked to be U.S. citizens, then your claim is kind of hollow. And there's no place that you can establish that the land is part of New York State or the United States, or that we are taxable by New York State. New York State thinks that they can tax us. I mean, they don't tax income, but they think every transaction we do on our territory, that they have the right to tax it. I'm not Seneca. But so if I buy something here, if I buy a carton of cigarettes, and I don't smoke, but if I buy cigarettes, New York State believes they have the right to tax that purchase. They don't, and they can't, and and they can make the claim, but they physically can't tax that, but they claim to have that right. And it's the same thing the federal government does. So, I mean, and all of this comes back to the same thing. And I know this is where people get uncomfortable, but it's racist. It is the whole idea, because let's be clear, New York State and you know, even Thomas Jefferson, when he talks about us becoming U.S. citizens, they still mean, I mean, that we're beneath them. The idea of becoming a U.S. citizen is not to be the equal to Thomas Jefferson. No, he's saying, yeah, this will be the end of their history. This will be the termination of their history. So we will cease to exist as what we previously were. So this isn't the idea of gaining something. He acknowledges that this will be them losing something and that we should be happy about it. Because this idea of being U.S. citizens means that they can have our land. So when anybody tries to say, well, you're no different, than us, they don't mean it that way. They mean, yes, you are different because you're less than us. You're a person of color. You don't have the same privilege that we have. In fact, the idea that I can tell you that you're no longer Native is my white privilege to be able to tell you that. And that's the manifestation of racism. To say that our distinction doesn't exist, that somehow a white man had the right to just say it and that it would just go away, that is inherently racist. Just like, again, back to this General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act, that they can not only try to lure us into this trap where we'll say, oh yeah, but you're not going to tax us on this, this, and this. Everything else you can tax us on, but not this, and this. And then they'll say, well, we're not sure about this one here. We have to determine whether this one is extravagant or not. Is this too much of a benefit? Are you getting too much? Because we get to decide that. You're going to help us determine what that parameter is. And then after we determine what is extravagant and not extravagant, we're going to tax you for it if you ever get a benefit that we're going to decide today where that limit to extravagance is. We'll tax you from that. And you're agreeing with that, right? You're agreeing with us, right? No, that's what's at play here. The statement that needs to be delivered in Washington, D.C. on December 3rd at this meeting, I guess, or whatever this is, this listening session, is to tell whomever is running this meeting, the Internal Revenue Service, we don't owe you shit. You don't have taxing authority over us. And the fact that you're even trying to do this, the fact that you're trying to carve out these little exemptions, is your own acknowledgement that you don't have it. That's why you're trying to do this. You're trying to gain taxing authority by creating these little exemptions. And we're on to you. See, that's the message that's got to come from the Seneca Nation and the Seneca Nation lawyers. Not saying, you know what, we might be able to slide annuities into that. Or maybe even sitting fees. No, you probably won't. Well, maybe you can slide annuities in it. But everything else, let's be clear. Annuities are a great thing that people get, right? But it's not enough to look. If you live off your annuities, you're living below the poverty line. You're not living off of that. It might help you make a car payment or a house payment or something like that, or when I say house payment, I'm talking about an internal Seneca Nation mortgage program, or you buy a mobile home off territory, because if you don't pay that, they can pick it up and drag it out of there. So I don't want to confuse the issue. But there is no, look, this is why people have to understand how important it is that at some point we draw that line in the sand over our distinction. And, it isn't even just over taxes. I go back to the same concerns I have about, talking with Matt Hill when he's in here, talking about fighting a speeding ticket. How is it that we're still allowing anybody to assert that certain parts of this community, Cattaraugus Territory of Seneca Nation, lie within Erie County or Chautauqua County or Cattaraugus County, or worse yet, in the town of Collins or the town of Brant or the town of Irving. How? How is that we are allowing this? The deeds the Seneca Nation issues, when they describe land, they don't just give the GPS coordinates, or they say all that land on such and such a marker, such and such a marker on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. They go on and they say in the town of Brant, county of Erie, state of New York. My buddy Matt said, I don't want a deed that says that. Do you think they would remove that language from the deed? No, you know what they did? They redacted it. They just put black over the top of it. They didn't even take the time to say, you're right. In fact, we need to pass a resolution that we no longer use state, county, and town in the description of the properties of Seneca Nation deeds. Thank you, Matt Hill, for bringing that up. No, they just redacted his. Come on, folks. We got to do better than this. We've got to do better than this. And you know what? The address for the William Seneca building isn't Irving, New York. It's the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. It's not Irving, New York. The Seneca Administration Building in Allegheny is not city of Salamanca, state of New York. It's the Allegheny territory of the Seneca Nation. Can we get the damn thing right? We're not them. We're not taxable. I want to thank you guys for listening. Please check out some of the stuff that I'm talking about here. You can find a lot of this information. Reach out to me if you want to learn more. I'll point you in a direction. We all need to understand these concepts and make sure that the people who are carrying our voices for us understand them too. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.